It was the kind of summer night where the air felt sticky and heavy, even after sundown. Dean Goodson had always been a fan of late-night drives, but this particular trip had been a spur-of-the-moment thing. He and his three friends, Laura, Marcus, and Tim, were road tripping through North Carolina with no real destination in mind. They'd just passed through Fayetteville and decided to make a quick stop in Bladenboro. The tiny gas station they pulled into looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 70s, with its peeling paint and flickering neon open sign. Dean parked his truck under the buzzing canopy lights while his dog Scout, a scruffy terrier mix, dozed in the back seat. Dean was the kind of guy who always seemed up for an adventure, but this trip wasn't about excitement. It was more about escape. Back home in San Francisco, where he worked as a delivery driver, life had started to feel too predictable. Nights like these, with the open road ahead and nothing but miles of possibilities, made him feel alive. "Get me a soda," Marcus called as Dean and Tim got out of the truck. Laura was already stretching her legs, glancing nervously at the dark woods that bordered the station. Inside, the gas station was quiet, save for the hum of a ceiling fan. A few locals loitered near the counter, giving the group polite nods. Dean grabbed a couple of waters and a bag of chips, trying not to think too hard about the ancient hunting magazine he'd flipped through earlier that week. It had been full of folklore about strange creatures in the southeast. Stories about things that could mimic voices, stalk prey for miles, and vanish without a trace. At the time, he'd laughed it off. Now, standing under the fluorescent lights, those stories felt a little closer to home. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees with a sound like whispered secrets. Scout was awake now, standing on alert with her ears perked. "What's her deal?" Laura asked, her voice low. Dean shrugged, but he could feel the tension creeping in. It wasn't unusual for Scout to be skittish in unfamiliar places, but this was different. She was growling softly, her gaze fixed on the line of trees beyond the gas station. "We should go," Laura said, her unease infectious. The group piled back into the truck, joking nervously about spooky small towns. But as Dean drove out of the gas station lot and onto a back road that wound through the woods, the laughter faded. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain hammered down, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. The road was barely visible, and the truck's headlights seemed to illuminate only the nearest trees, leaving the rest of the world cloaked in darkness. That's when they heard it. A sharp, metallic slam against the side of the truck. Dean's hands tightened on the wheel as Scout barked furiously. "What the hell was that?" Tim asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, something darted across the road ahead. It was fast, too fast for them to see clearly, but the impression it left behind was wrong. Too big, too human. Dean slammed on the brakes, sending everyone jolting forward. The truck skidded to a stop, the rain pounding relentlessly. "What did you see?" Marcus demanded, but Dean couldn't answer. His heart was hammering in his chest, his mind replaying the brief glimpse of the creature. It had been hunched, its limbs elongated, its movement unnatural. A sound came from the woods, low and guttural, like a growl but deeper. It sent a chill down Dean's spine. Scout was barking wildly now, her small body pressed against the door as though she wanted to leap out and defend them. "We're leaving," Dean said, his voice firm. He threw the truck into reverse, but before he could back up, something hit the rear bumper hard enough to rock the vehicle. Marcus shouted, and Laura screamed as the truck's cabin filled with a terrible scratching sound, like claws raking against metal. Dean floored it, the tires spinning on the wet road before finding traction. The truck surged forward, but the sense of being followed was palpable. Whatever was out there wasn't giving up easily. The growling grew louder, punctuated by snapping branches and the occasional flash of movement in the periphery. "Keep driving," Laura yelled, her voice barely audible over the storm. The truck finally broke free of the woods, the road opening up into a clearing with an abandoned campsite. The group didn't want to stop, but the truck's engine sputtered, and Dean knew they couldn't keep going without a quick check. They jumped out, Scout at Dean's side. Her leash taut as she strained against it. As they inspected the truck under the pale beam of a flashlight, the sense of being watched grew unbearable. The storm's fury seemed to lessen for a moment, the rain softening to a mist, and that's when they saw it. Standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible but undeniably there, was the figure. It was humanoid but wrong, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "What is that?" Tim whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature didn't move. Then, it let out a sound that Dean could only describe as a mockery of human speech, a distorted, echoing mimicry of their own voices. It sent the group scrambling back into the truck. The engine roared to life on the second try, and they sped off, leaving the clearing and the thing behind. The creature didn't follow this time. They made it back to the main road, the truck wheezing but holding together. By the time they reached a motel in the next town, they were soaked, shaken, and silent. No one spoke of what they'd seen, but the looks they exchanged said enough. Dean sat up that night, Scout curled in his lap, unable to sleep. The magazine article came back to him, the one that mentioned skinwalkers, creatures of Navajo legend known for their ability to mimic and stalk. He hadn't believed it then. Now, he wasn't so sure. The Ozark Mountains stretched endlessly before them, their rugged peaks blanketed in vibrant green as spring had fully awakened. The air was fresh, with the faint tang of earth and blooming wildflowers. Keanu Norris eased his truck up a winding road, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires blending with the soft rumble of the engine. His friends, Mia, Jake, and Laura, were in the cab with him, while his dog, Blaze, a lively German shepherd with a sharp nose for trouble, lounged in the truck bed. Keanu was a firefighter from a small town in the Midwest. Growing up in a rural area, he'd spent most of his life hunting in the surrounding woods, which had sharpened his senses and taught him respect for nature's unpredictability. The Ozarks, though, were unfamiliar territory, their dense forests and steep ridges carrying a wildness that felt different from home. He'd heard stories about the area, rumors passed around campfires and in hushed tones at hunting lodges. There were always tales in places like this, strange noises, disappearing livestock, shadows where there shouldn't be. Most of it was probably just legends, but Keanu had learned never to completely discount local lore. The trouble began just after noon. A grinding sound came from beneath the hood, and the truck shuddered violently before rolling to a stop on the side of the dirt road. Keanu cursed under his breath and climbed out to check the engine. The others followed, Blaze hopping down and sniffing the air, his tail wagging. "Well, that's just perfect," Mia muttered, shading her eyes as she looked around. The sky had grown overcast, the clouds hanging low and heavy like a gray blanket. "Do you even know how to fix this thing?" "Maybe," Keanu replied, though the tangled mess of wires and metal under the hood didn't inspire much confidence. Jake wandered a few feet away, peering into the trees. "We're in the middle of nowhere, man. What are we supposed to do if you can't fix it?" "There's a town a few miles back," Laura said, though her voice was uncertain. "Maybe we could walk it?" Keanu frowned. He didn't like the idea of leaving the truck, but staying put wasn't much better. They'd been off the main road for hours, and the chances of someone passing by were slim. As he worked, Blaze growled low in his throat, his ears perked. Keanu paused, glancing toward the dog. "What is it, boy?" he asked, but Blaze only stared into the trees, his hackles raised. The first encounter was subtle, almost easy to miss, a flicker of movement in the dense undergrowth, too quick and far away to make out clearly. Keanu straightened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the forest. The others noticed his unease and fell silent, their own gazes following his. "What did you see?" Mia whispered. "I don't know," Keanu admitted. "Could have been a deer." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't right. There was something about the way it moved, not like an animal, but different, deliberate, watching. They decided to make camp while Keanu tried to piece together a solution for the truck. A fire crackled in a makeshift pit, its smoke curling into the cool, cloudy air. Blaze lay at Keanu's side, though the dog's usual relaxed demeanor was gone. His ears twitched constantly, his eyes darting toward the trees. As night fell, the unease grew. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual chorus of insects and birds absent. Keanu's thoughts drifted to his family, to the hunting trips with his father that had taught him how to move silently through the woods, how to track, and how to listen. He remembered his dad's words, "It's not the things you see that'll get you, it's the ones you don't." The attack came just as they were starting to settle in for the night. A low, guttural noise echoed through the woods, followed by a crashing sound as something large barreled through the undergrowth. Blaze leapt to his feet, barking furiously, and the group scrambled for weapons. Pocket knives, branches, anything they could find. Keanu caught a glimpse of it then. A figure just beyond the firelight. Its shape was wrong, humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long, its movements unnaturally smooth. It didn't charge but circled, staying just out of reach, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Stay together," Keanu shouted, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The creature lunged suddenly, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. It grabbed Jake, pulling him toward the trees with a strength that defied reason. The others screamed, and Keanu lunged after it, slashing with his knife, but the thing was too quick. It disappeared into the shadows, taking Jake with it. There was no time to mourn or think. They had to move. Grabbing what they could carry, Keanu led the group down the trail, Blaze at his side. The dog was their only warning, growling whenever the creature came too close. The route out was harrowing. The thing followed them, its glowing eyes appearing and disappearing in the darkness. At one point, it let out a sound that chilled Keanu to the bone. A low, almost human wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They finally stumbled into a small village just as dawn broke, their clothes torn and muddy, their faces pale with exhaustion. The locals stared as they entered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Keanu called a friend to come pick them up, but they didn't talk about what had happened. Not then, not to the villagers, and not to the friend who eventually arrived. The story seemed too unbelievable, too insane. But as they left the Ozarks behind, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been lucky to escape at all. He never forgot those glowing eyes or the way the forest seemed to breathe around them, and he never went back to the Ozarks. Spring in Wisconsin is a time of rebirth, the forests coming alive with green canopies and blooming wildflowers. It was the perfect season for a hike, or so David Davidson had thought when he and his friends, Maggie, Tyler, and Lauren, had planned their day trip into the woods. The Kettle Moraine State Forest was known for its rolling hills and lush greenery, a stark contrast to the flat, arid lands of Texas where David grew up. It reminded him of his first spring out of college, when he'd moved to a larger city and taken up a job at the zoo, working with animals most people only saw in documentaries. David was a zookeeper by trade and a tinkerer by passion. Back in his cramped Texas garage, he had spent countless hours building custom computers, designing rigs for friends, or just losing himself in the hum of circuits and cooling fans. It was a far cry from the woods, but he appreciated the quiet focus both activities required. The hike started as a relaxing escape. They parked near a trailhead and packed their bags with snacks, water, and a couple of folding knives, more for utility than self-defense. The group walked at a leisurely pace, enjoying the fresh air and the occasional bursts of laughter from inside jokes that had carried them through years of friendship. The wind began to pick up in the late afternoon, whispering through the trees with an eerie insistence. Maggie, always the first to notice shifts in atmosphere, commented on how quickly the weather seemed to be changing. Clouds gathered above, and the sound of leaves rustling grew louder, almost drowning out their conversation. David remembered a TV show he'd once seen, a documentary about strange folklore creatures like skinwalkers, shapeshifters rumored to haunt the wilderness. The thought flickered in his mind briefly, but he dismissed it with a shake of his head. This was Wisconsin, not the deserts, episodes of Navajo lore. It was Tyler who first noticed something strange. They had stopped at a clearing to rest and share a granola bar, the wind tugging at their jackets and hair. Tyler froze mid-sentence, staring into the forest beyond the clearing. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice hushed. The others fell silent, straining to catch whatever sound he had heard. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, came a sound like a low, guttural growl. It was distant yet unmistakably there, threading through the rustle of leaves. "Probably just a coyote," Lauren said, though her tone was more nervous than reassuring. David's instincts kicked in. He'd worked with predators at the zoo and knew their sounds well, but this didn't match anything he was familiar with. It had a strange resonance, almost as if it were mimicking something it didn't fully understand. As they pressed on, unease hung over the group like a storm cloud. The trail narrowed, hemmed in by dense thickets of trees, and the wind seemed to howl in concert with their quickening pace. Then came the noise again, a chilling, almost human-sounding cry that made Maggie clutch David's arm. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. They didn't have to wait long to find out. A shadow darted between the trees, moving faster than anything humanly possible. David caught a glimpse, a humanoid shape, its limbs elongated and its movements jerky and unnatural. The creature let out another cry, louder this time, a noise that seemed to echo from all directions. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged from the shadows, swiping at Lauren. She fell backward with a scream, clutching her leg as blood seeped through her jeans. David and Tyler sprang into action, brandishing their knives and shouting to drive it back. The creature retreated momentarily, its glowing eyes watching them with a predatory intelligence. "We need to get out of here," David said, his voice firm despite the adrenaline surging through him. Lauren could barely stand, and the group decided to set up a fire near a rocky outcrop where they could keep watch. David's mind raced as he helped tend to Lauren's wound. He thought of his parents, of his dad's meticulous way of solving problems, and his mom's quiet resilience. He wished he could call them, but there was no signal out here. Instead, he focused on the fire, its flickering light casting long shadows that seemed to dance mockingly in the trees. The creature didn't stay away for long. They heard it circling, its cries growing closer and more insistent. Blaze-like eyes glinted in the darkness, watching them from the periphery of the firelight. "Why is it just watching us?" Maggie whispered. "Waiting," David said grimly. When dawn broke, they decided they couldn't wait any longer. Lauren, though weak, insisted she could move if they helped her. They abandoned their makeshift camp and moved as quickly as they could toward the car. The creature followed, keeping just out of sight but letting them know it was there. Every now and then, they heard its chilling cries, the sound cutting through the morning air like a knife. By the time they reached the car, the group was on the verge of collapse. David fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, as Tyler and Maggie helped Lauren into the back seat. As the engine roared to life, David caught one last glimpse of the creature in the rearview mirror, standing on the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes fixed on them as they sped away. They didn't stop until they reached a gas station miles away. There, they called for help and attended to Lauren's wound more thoroughly. When asked what had happened, they gave vague answers, unwilling to share the full truth. David never forgot the encounter. The creature's cries haunted his dreams, and every time the wind howled, he couldn't help but remember the eyes watching him from the trees. The gas station was one of those old-timey, weathered ones you only see in places like rural North Carolina. Its peeling paint and the faded sign out front were almost picturesque, a reminder of a slower-paced time. Dean Goodson pulled the van into the lot, its tires crunching on the gravel. The humid summer air was thick, heavy, with the promise of a storm. His friends Sarah, Marcus, and Jay were crammed into the van with him, along with Shadow, his golden mutt, who had a knack for sniffing out trouble and stealing attention wherever they went. Dean was used to the city, the constant hum of San Francisco, where he worked as a delivery driver. Out here, though, it was different. Bladenboro felt eerily quiet, like the world was holding its breath. He'd read about places like this in magazines he used to flip through while waiting on shipments. Remote, mysterious little towns with legends older than the roads that led to them. Inside the gas station, the air was thick with the scent of motor oil and cheap coffee. Dean grabbed a map off a rack and pretended to study it while Marcus bought snacks. The attendant behind the counter looked at them with a kind of wary curiosity, like they didn't belong. "You folks camping around here?" the man asked, his accent thick. "Just passing through," Dean replied, though it wasn't entirely true. They'd planned to spend a couple of nights camping in the woods nearby. The idea had seemed fun back in San Francisco, but now Dean wasn't so sure. Something about the way the attendant stared made his skin crawl. The storm rolled in not long after they set up camp. Thunder grumbled low in the distance, and the trees around them shivered in the rising wind. Dean and his friends huddled around the fire, telling stories and laughing to shake off the unease that had settled over them since the gas station. Shadow sat at Dean's feet, his ears twitching at every sound. Dean absently scratched behind the dog's ears, trying to focus on Sarah's story about her wildest college party. But his thoughts kept drifting. He remembered a magazine he'd read years ago, one that had mentioned the Bladenboro beast, some kind of creature that had supposedly stalked the area in the 1950s. Locals had blamed it for livestock deaths, but the descriptions of the creature were all over the place. Part wolf, part cat, part something else entirely. It was the kind of folklore that made for a good campfire story, but now, sitting out here with the storm raging, it felt uncomfortably real. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. The fire had burned low, and most of them were dozing in their chairs. Shadow's growl was what woke Dean, low, menacing, and unlike anything he'd heard from the dog before. He sat up, blinking against the darkness, and saw the fur on Shadow's back standing on end. "What is it, boy?" Dean whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Shadow didn't respond, just stared into the trees. Dean followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Still, an unease crept over him, as if the woods themselves were watching. Then came the sound, a rustling, faint at first, then louder, like something moving through the underbrush. Dean's heart pounded as he grabbed the flashlight. The beam swept across the trees, illuminating the rain-soaked leaves, but nothing else. "Probably just an animal," Marcus muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. The rustling grew closer. Dean stood, knife in hand, as the others woke and scrambled to their feet. The firelight flickered against the dark, casting eerie shadows. And then they saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, hunched and misshapen. At first, Dean thought it was a person, a hunter maybe, but as the light caught it, he realized how wrong he was. The thing was too tall, its limbs too long and thin, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. The head was human-like, but the eyes glowed in the firelight, and the mouth was wrong, stretching into a snarl that didn't fit its face. Sarah screamed, and the thing lunged forward. Shadow barked and growled, placing himself between Dean and the creature. Dean swung the flashlight wildly, the beam catching the thing's face again before it darted back into the woods. Dean shouted, grabbing Shadow's collar and pulling him toward the trail. They ran, slipping on the muddy ground, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind them. It wasn't just following, it was circling, its glowing eyes flashing through the trees as if it were toying with them. The storm was in full force now, rain hammering down and turning the dirt trail into a slick mess. Dean could barely see, his flashlight cutting through the darkness just enough to keep him on the path. Shadow barked frantically, pulling against the leash, but Dean held tight. They finally reached the van, fumbling with the keys as the creature closed in. Dean could hear it, feel it, just beyond the edge of the light. The others piled in, and Dean barely managed to slam the door shut before it hit the side of the van with a force that rocked the entire vehicle. "Drive!" Sarah screamed, and Dean didn't hesitate. The van tore out of the campsite, the tires struggling for traction on the muddy road. The creature chased them, its long limbs carrying it unnervingly fast. Dean's hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, his knuckles white as he navigated the twisting back roads. Eventually, the lights of Bladenboro came into view, and the creature vanished into the shadows, as if it couldn't or wouldn't follow them into the town. They parked outside a diner, shaking and soaked to the bone. None of them spoke for a long time, the reality of what they'd seen sinking in. Dean kept glancing back toward the woods, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back. He never wanted to believe in the stories, but now he couldn't forget. The beast of Bladenboro, or whatever it was real, and it was still out there,